Well, hello there. I've never read the Bible, so I decided to read the Bible. Simply because I want to know more about Christianity. And there are many things about Christianity which I do appreciate. I really love Christian choirs, Orthodox and Catholic choirs. And I also love the architecture of Orthodox and Catholic churches, the beautiful cathedrals. And also I feel like Christians get a lot of things right, even if it is simply just by their adherence to tradition and therefore by extension adherence to family values. So let's get to it. I decided to start with the New Testament simply because that's the Christian one, and the version of the Bible that I am reading is this King James Bible. The reason why I chose King James is simply because I feel like that is the version that gets quoted the most in movies and other media. It has the oldest, most poetic, most beautiful language, I think. So I just went with this one. But I also am supplementing with this Polish version of the Bible, because Polish is my native language and it helps here and there. There are also subtle differences between the two versions here and there, but most of the time they are pretty consistent. I don't know if there's more than one version in Polish. I just have this one laying around, so that's the one I'm using. It is as old as I am, so it's pretty old by now. So let's get to it. The New Testament begins with the four Gospels, which are four separate accounts of Jesus' life, mostly concerning few last months of his life, I assume. Perhaps it's a few last years, it's not exactly specified. And the first of the Gospels that appears in the Bible is the Gospel of Matthew. And, by the way, before we really get into it, I have to specify that this is not going to be a comprehensive analysis. I'm just going to be talking about whatever stood out to me in the text. And I'm going to be bringing up some quotes that I've encountered before in other places. So the Gospel of Matthew, I've got my notes here by the way, so that's what I'm going to be looking down at all the time. The Gospel of Matthew begins with a genealogy of Jesus, supposedly. It tries to prove that Jesus is descendant from David, King David from the Old Testament. But I don't really understand it, because the genealogy only shows that Joseph is descendant from King David, and therefore also from Abraham, and therefore also from Adam. But Joseph is not the actual father of Jesus, is he? Jesus is the Son of God because of the whole Immaculate Conception thing with his mother Mary. So this genealogy here only proves that Joseph is the descendant of David, who is not the father of Jesus. So it's already pretty confusing right off the bat. So yes, I don't know what to make of that, but let's keep going. So the Gospel of Matthew goes on to describe the story of Jesus' conception and birth, the way that most of us know it. And then we have a big time skip to when Jesus is already an adult. One of the main things that surprised me while reading the Gospels, including the Gospel of Matthew, is just how many people Jesus heals of their illnesses with his powers. I've always heard about Jesus healing the sick, but before I never quite realized the scale of that healing. He heals thousands upon thousands of people. Entire populations of cities go out to him in the desert in order to have their sick cured. And that's not the way that I've imagined it before. One of the first events in the Gospel of Matthew is Jesus recruiting these fishermen in order for them to become his apostles. And the way he does it is he just shows up, he tells them to follow him, and they drop everything, they drop their nets, they leave their boats behind, and they go after him, just like that. And I found that somewhat humorous. And later on in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, Jesus even goes on to say that it is not good for people to want to say goodbye to their families or even go to their father's funeral before following him. That's an event that happens in the Gospel of Luke chapter 9. But going back to the Gospel of Matthew. One of the very first famous quotes that I've known about before, that I found in the Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, appears in chapter 5, verse 5. And that quote is, "The meek shall inherit the earth." The exact quote is, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." So that is a very famous quote, you hear it all the time, especially by those who criticize Christianity. But it's just another one of those quotes that could be interpreted in many different ways. And what exactly was that quote in the original language of the Bible? How was it translated? It's very much up to interpretation here. Another one of the famous quotes that I found appears also in chapter 5, verse 17. And here Jesus talks about how he doesn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. And the way that is interpreted is that he does not actually come in to destroy the old Jewish Old Testament law that includes things such as circumcision and not eating pigs, which is contradicted later on in the New Testament in the Acts and the letters of Paul, but we'll get there when we get there. Later on in chapter 5 of Matthew, Jesus goes on to describe different sins that he stands against. And one of these sins is adultery. And in the context of adultery, Jesus himself says, "If thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee." Which I can see how that can be interpreted by different cults such as Heaven's Gate, which castrated their own members in order to prevent them from indulging in sexual activities. Because that's a quality of many religions, especially young religions. They are very much life-denying, and they stand against sexuality and reproduction, and they are very apocalyptic. It is also interesting to point out that, still in chapter 5, another one of those things which Jesus says that he stands against is swearing oaths. Jesus does not want you to swear oaths, which goes against a lot of Christianity as it developed in Europe, medieval Europe, into modern times. Another one of the very famous quotes that we encounter in the Gospel of Matthew, it's still in chapter 5, verse 39. "Whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." And later on it goes on to say, "Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you." This sentiment is also repeated in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verse 29. Which says what exactly? Let me check. "And unto him that smiteth thee on the one cheek, offer also the other. And him that taketh away thy cloak, forbid not to take thy coat also." So these are among the many quotes which are always brought up by critics of Christianity, and with good reason, I feel. I don't think that this advice is very good. It's going to turn you into a pushover. And I feel like Western civilization as a whole is suffering today because of the sentiment contained in these quotes. But let's move on. One of the things that I found humorous is that in the Gospel of Matthew and in other Gospels, everywhere in the New Testament actually, publicans, which were tax collectors, are always brought up as an example of bad people, as sinners, and they are always looked down at, which makes sense. I don't personally oppose the idea of taxes, but to these Jews, tax collectors took away their money and they gave it away to an occupying force of the Roman Empire. So I understand why they really hated tax collectors. Later on in the Gospel of Matthew we also have the Lord's Prayer, which is a very famous prayer. O Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, and so on and so on. I did not know that this prayer comes from the Bible, but now I do. In chapter 6 of the Gospel of Matthew we get a famous quote which is repeated many times throughout this Gospel and other Gospels. The line is, O ye of little faith. You hear that one all the time. And the first time that it shows up, it's in the context of a very bizarre fragment, which is in chapter 6, which tells you that you shouldn't worry about food or clothing, you shouldn't sow, because if you believe in God hard enough, God is going to take care of those things for you. Because birds, for example, they do not sow, they do not harvest, but God still feeds them. But that's another one of those fragments which could be interpreted in many different ways, so let's just move on from that. But I will also say that this sentiment is repeated in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12. Another famous line concerns casting pearls before swine. And the line goes like this. Give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet, and turn again and rend you. That appears in chapter 7 of the Gospel of Matthew. Another famous quote, also in chapter 7, is, Therefore all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do you even so to them. So do unto others what you would want to have done unto you. I've heard it in that version or something like that before. So that's a very basic, famous moral lesson there. And another line. This line I find particularly interesting. Very famous line. It appears also in chapter 7, verse 16. Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. You hear that very often, that's a very famous line. But the line goes on to say something else, and I find the second part of the line to be even more important. You shall know them by their fruits. You shall know them by their fruits. To me personally, that is the most significant and the best line in the entire New Testament that I've read so far. You shall know them by their fruits. This line here, or at least the sentiment contained in this line, this is the major reason why I'm reading the Bible in the first place. Because I've been looking at Christians and I've been judging them by their fruits. And I found these fruits to be better than the fruits of most people in modern times. It seems that a lot of Christians, especially young Christians in the younger generations, have a lot of stuff figured out better than other people nowadays. It seems that Christians are among few people left who are still trying to live virtuous lives. They are still trying to have young families, and they're raising up their kids to be decent people. But that could simply be because Christians are all about traditional values, and family values are in the package of traditional values. Judging people by their fruit is one of the best things that you can do in life. Look at people and see how they live, what's the relationship between them and their families, their children, their community, and by that you will be able to tell which person is worth emulating and which isn't. But moving on. A very significant event that happens in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 8, and this is very important. A centurion, which is a Roman soldier, comes up to Jesus and he asks him to heal his servant, because his servant is sick and presumably dying. And Jesus is very impressed by the centurion's faith, because the centurion says that if Jesus will only say that the servant will be healed, the servant will be healed, and the centurion will believe it. He will believe in Jesus' word. He won't have to even witness the miracle. And Jesus goes on to say that he hasn't seen faith like this anywhere else in Israel. And this is a significant event, because this is the first time in the Bible that we see an interaction between Jesus and a Gentile, a non-Jew. And here we see that Jesus is very willing to extend his grace and his powers to non-Jews. There is a discussion going on in some circles about the exact nature of Jesus' identity. Was he a Jew? Wasn't he a Jew? And what exactly is a Jew? Is it a religion? Is it a race? Well, the honest answer to that question is that the Jews are most definitely a race. You can very much be an atheistic Jew. But when the Bible uses the word Jew, does it mean the race or does it mean the religion? Because the Bible does give a lot of examples of Gentiles which were possibly in a process of converting to Judaism, or were at the very least sympathetic to Judaism. So there is a definite gray area there. How popular was converting to Judaism among Gentiles in this time period? But if you are a Christian and you believe in the Bible, you really can't argue that Jesus was indeed ethnically a Jew. He gets called a Jew and a rabbi many times right to his face. And he is supposed to descend from the line of David and Abraham. I suppose that you can be a Christian and say that the Bible is not true. You are allowed to do that, that's fair. But it's very tricky. It's very tricky because at that point, what even is Christianity? But moving on. Later on in chapter 8, we get more of Jesus' interactions with the Gentiles when he goes into a country of a people called the Gergesenes. And when he is there, he heals 2 people of demonic possessions. In the Gospel of Matthew it is 2 people, in later Gospels it is just 1 person. And then the demons go into a herd of pigs and the pigs jump off a cliff and die. It's a whole big story. But the entire city of the Gergesenes come out and marvel at what he did, but I guess they get intimidated by his powers. They don't know what to think about him, so they tell him to leave, and he leaves. And later on, in chapter 10, Jesus instructs his disciples to not go to the Gentiles, but to only preach to Jews. And I quote, "These 12 Jesus sent forth, and commanded them, saying, Go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So here we have Jesus saying to his disciples not to go to Gentiles, not to preach to Gentiles, not to heal their sick, but to only do that for the Jews. So there's that. Another one of the things that I found to be rather surprising while reading the Bible is in chapter 10 of the Gospel of Matthew, that Jesus gives his 12 disciples the power to heal and to do other miracles, possibly even to resurrect the dead. And that's not the way that I ever imagined it before. To me, Jesus was always the only guy who could do miracles, but apparently he also had the power to bestow that power onto others, as he did with his 12 disciples and also with other people, as we will see later on. another one of the very famous lines also shows up in chapter 10. Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents, and as harmless as doves. Yet another very famous line, and also a very important one, is from chapter 10 also. Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I come not to send peace, but a sword. So this is spoken by Jesus himself, and this line is always brought up by Christians when they are accused that their religion is a little bit too pacifistic and too passive. So they always tell you this, that Jesus told them that he brings sword and not peace. However, there are other lines in the Bible that contradict this. This line is contradicted in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, in verse 55 and 56. In this situation, a city rejected Jesus, and his disciples asked him if he wanted them to make fire rain down from the sky on the city. And Jesus rebuked them, I quote here, "But he turned and rebuked them, and said, Ye know not what manner of spirit you are of, for the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." However, in the Polish version of the Bible, this is somewhat different. In the Polish version of the Bible, the direct quote by Jesus is missing. It simply says that he rebukes them and then they walk away. But it's essentially the same meaning. It's the same sentiment here. However, this sentiment is contradicted in the very same Gospel of Luke, in chapter 12, verse 49, when Jesus says, "I am come to send fire on the earth." So it does seem like Jesus does indeed come to bring fire and the sword, rather than peace, like he says in the original line in the Gospel of Matthew, which we will go back to now. That Jesus does not come to bring peace, he comes to bring the sword. Now, Christians bring that up a lot in order to prove that the religion is not weak. However, they are ignoring the latter part of this fragment here, which goes on to say that Jesus wants to set family members against each other. And he says that whoever loves their family more than they love Jesus is not worthy of him. So you can take out of that what you want. I have also noticed several points in the Bible where Jesus is being quite disregarding, and I would also say disrespectful, to his family, and especially his mother. And the first time that this happens is in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, and the same situation that is described here is repeated in other Gospels as well. It's when Jesus is surrounded by a crowd of people listening to his preachings, and his family, including his mother, can't get to him through the crowd. And when Jesus hears about this, what he has to say is essentially that who is my family, who is my mother? My real family are those who accept the word of God. And another situation like this happens in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, when Jesus with his entire family is visiting Jerusalem for some kind of a holiday. And when they leave, they notice that Jesus is not among them. And they get worried and they look for him for several days. He is missing for several days. And they finally go back to Jerusalem and they find him back in the temple. And his mother tells him that they were very worried about him and where was he? And he essentially just tells them that I'm just doing my job, I'm just preaching. Why are you surprised? Moving on with the Gospel of Matthew, we have another very famous line about the blind leading the blind in chapter 15. And the line goes like this exactly. Let them alone, they be blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. And this is spoken by Jesus in the context of speaking about the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were a group of Jews which were the main opponents of Jesus. They were a kind of an spiritual and I think also an intellectual elite of Jewish society. They believed in the Old Testament, they believed in resurrection, they believed in spirits and angels, but they didn't exactly agree that Jesus was the Messiah. Another Jewish group, which was among the main opponents of Jesus, were the Sadducees. That's how I believe it's pronounced. And the Sadducees I personally find to be very interesting because they believed in God, they believed in the Old Testament, but they did not believe in an afterlife. They didn't believe in the resurrection. And the reason why I find that interesting is because nowadays people really want to put you in these narrow boxes of narrow perspectives. If you spend any time in YouTube comment section, for example, you may be inclined to start believing that the only options is to either be religious, which therefore means that you believe in an all-powerful, all-knowing God, and you believe in souls and an afterlife, or you are an atheist, and therefore you believe in the Big Bang Theory, you believe in evolution, and in everything else that comes out of the mainstream scientific society. But when we look at history, things were not always this narrow and simple. You could, for example, believe in God, but not believe in an afterlife or souls, like the Sadducees. And also what I mean by resurrection here. In the Bible, it seems that the vision of the afterlife is somewhat different than the current mainstream version of an afterlife that Christians seem to have. In the Bible, it doesn't seem that after you die you go to heaven or hell. It seems that after you die you simply are dead, but at some point in the future Jesus is going to come back, God is going to come back, and He's going to resurrect everybody. Everybody who has ever lived throughout history is going to be resurrected and judged. And those which were loyal to God, those which were good, are going to be allowed to live forever in the new world. And those which were not loyal to God, those which were bad, are presumably going to be destroyed in an everlasting fire. But it's not entirely clear because some lines in the Bible tend to be contradictory on this. For example, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16, there is a short parable about two separate men which go into an afterlife which does resemble a modern vision of hell and heaven, in which the sinners are going to burn and suffer forever. Also in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, verse 43, during Jesus' crucifixion, Jesus says to one of the thieves, which is being crucified right next to him, that he is going to go into paradise along him on the very same day. And I'll quote here directly, I guess. And Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. So he says that today he shall be with him in paradise right after they die. So this goes against the narrative that after you die you are dead, but you are going to be resurrected one day. However, in the Gospel of John, chapter 5, verse 29, we get a line that supports the narrative of the resurrection. And shall come forth they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. So this to me implies that both the reward and the damnation is going to happen after the resurrection and not straight after the death. Continuing with the Gospel of Matthew, we have another of the more important interactions of Jesus with the Gentiles, when a woman of Canaan goes up to Jesus, seeking to be healed from her illness. But Jesus is initially very disregarding of her, and he tells her that it is not fit to take away from children to give to dogs. And what he is saying here is that it is not worthy to give to the Gentiles that which belongs to the Jews. But the woman tells him that even dogs eat crumbs that fall from the plates of their masters. And Jesus is very impressed by her faith, and he does give her what she wants. He does heal her. So this could be interpreted in many different ways. His initial disregarding could be interpreted that he was merely testing the woman, and he wasn't actually genuinely being cruel to her. But he does essentially call Gentiles dogs in this fragment, and that's why it's significant. And this event happens in other Gospels as well, such as the Gospel of Mark, in chapter 7 of the Gospel of Mark. Another one of the more famous lines, which appears in the Gospel of Matthew, is, "But whoso shall offend one of these little ones, which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea." And this line is repeated almost word for word in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17. In the Gospel of Matthew, it comes up in chapter 18. And this line is always brought up in the context of people abusing children, especially the American elites and what they do to children. You always hear that line come up, and it is a good line. I do agree with that line. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 19, we have a little bit about divorce. People are arguing with Jesus about divorce, and they ask him if it is lawful, because Moses did allow them to divorce their wives. But Jesus tells them that no, it is not good to divorce their wives, and Moses only allowed it because they were so depraved and sinful that he simply didn't have any other choice. But Jesus does not allow for divorces. And the people that he is arguing with answer to him that in that case it is not even worth it to marry in the first place, because it's too risky. And he answers them with a very peculiar line, and that line goes on as follows. "For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb, some which were made by men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it." So this is another one of those lines which support the activities of different cults, such as Heaven's Gate, which castrated their own members. In chapter 19 there is another famous line. "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God." So this is one of the many lines in the New Testament which go against rich people and people who accumulate wealth. You are supposed to give everything away to the poor and live in poverty, and I suppose also not leave anything to your children, which is a sentiment that I do not agree with. In chapter 20, we get a famous line, somewhat famous line, you hear it here and there. "Many that are first shall be last, and the last shall be first." And this line comes up in the context of a parable of vineyard workers. In the parable, there is a vineyard owner which hires some workers, and he offers them a penny for a day's work. So he hires some workers in the morning, but later on in the evening he goes on to hire some more workers, and he also promises them a penny at the end of the day. So at the end of the day he does pay his workers a penny, even though some of them worked since the morning throughout the entire day and the blistering sun, and others only worked for an hour in the evening. And when the people who worked since the morning try to complain about it, the vineyard owner rebukes them and says that he has the right to pay his workers whatever he wants, and he gave them what he promised them, so they shouldn't complain. Which, from my point of view, is just not fair, but who am I? In some circles there is a discussion about who exactly was responsible for the death of Jesus, Some people want to say that it's the Gentiles, the Romans, other people say it's the Jews. Well, according to the Bible, here in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 20, we get a line that says, in verse 19, that chief priests and scribes, which are Jews, will condemn Jesus to death and deliver him to the Gentiles, to mock and crucify. So here it implies a shared responsibility between the Jews and the Gentiles. But later on, also in the Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 27, verse 25, when Pilate washes his hands and says that he does not want to kill Jesus, but the Jews want to kill Jesus, the Jews answer him that the blood of Jesus is on them and on their children. So here the Bible says that the Jews hold the responsibility for Jesus' death. In chapter 21 we have another somewhat humorous fragment where Jesus curses a fig tree for not having any fruit on it. In the Gospel of Matthew the tree withers instantly, while in the Gospel of Mark they find the tree withered the next day. And the Gospel of Mark goes on to further specify that it wasn't even fig season, and Jesus cursed the tree anyway for not having any fruit on it. I quote here in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 11, verse 13, "And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet." And this is the King James Version. However, in the Polish version of the Bible that I have, it says that it was indeed fig season. So it goes against what the English King James Version says. So this is one of the few places where the translation actually differs. So at least in the Polish version it was the fig season, but the tree didn't have any fruit, so Jesus cursed it. I understand what this fragment here is trying to convey. I understand the metaphorical moral lesson. However, when you read it on a literal level, it does seems rather harsh and somewhat unreasonable. And more than that, this is also contradicted in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 13, where we have a parable in which a fig tree has not borne any fruit for 3 consecutive years, and they still give it a chance for 1 more year after fertilizing it. So in this parable in the Gospel of Luke, it is much more reasonable, I feel, than this similar situation is portrayed in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Back in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, verse 43, we have another very important line when Jesus is addressing the chief priests and Pharisees, and he tells them, "The kingdom of God shall be taken from you, and given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof." So here Jesus is criticizing Jews and telling them that Christianity will be given to the Gentiles and nations which appreciate it. Later on in the same chapter, Jesus is still arguing with the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they are trying to get him to say something that is illegal. They are trying to get him to fat boast, so that they can report him and get him arrested. So they ask him whether it is lawful for them to pay taxes to Caesar, to the Roman Empire. But Jesus can see right through these crafty Jews, and he tells them, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." So he tells them that yes, indeed, you should pay taxes, and you're not gonna get me to say something which is illegal. Another very interesting fragment shows up in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 22. And this fragment concerns relationships after death. Because the Sadducees, which do not believe in the resurrection, they do not believe in the afterlife, they ask Jesus about what the relationship between spouses is supposed to be after death. And they bring up an example of a woman who has had a husband which died, so she married another man, and that man also died, and so on and so forth. She went through 7 husbands, and then she died also. So the Sadducees ask Jesus, in the day of the resurrection, which one of these 7 men is going to be the proper husband of the woman. And Jesus answers them that, "For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven." And further he goes on to say, "God is not the God of the dead, but of the living." And so here essentially Jesus tells them that after death people will not be married anymore, but they are going to be individuals and they are going to be as the angels of God. So marriages end with death. And this sentiment is also repeated in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 20. So this fragment really surprised me because it does not conform to what I think the modern Christian vision of the afterlife is like. Further, in chapter 23, Jesus is criticizing Pharisees and scribes for being vain and decadent, and he tells people that they shouldn't call anybody in this life rabbi or father, for there is only one Father who is God. And I found this to be particularly ironic because pretty much in every single Christian denomination the priests are called fathers. And it's especially ironic because in this Polish version of the Bible that I have right here, right at the start here it says that this Bible has been redacted and edited by His Excellency, the Bishop, Priest, so-and-so. So this is especially ironic because this guy is calling himself His Excellency, while this fragment here in the Bible tells you that not only you should call nobody father, but also whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. Later on in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus goes on to talk about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which is something that has not happened yet during Jesus' life, but it has probably happened already before the Gospels were written. Some people would like to argue otherwise. We don't really know at the end of the day, but that's not my point. My point is that here Jesus says that the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was supposed to be one of the signs of the end times. And he goes on to say that, "Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass, till all these things be fulfilled." And in the Gospel of Mark, it is further said that some who stand here won't taste death before all these things will come to pass, before rapture comes, the end times. And in many other points in the New Testament we also see this belief that early Christians seemed to think that the end times were right around the corner. They very much were an apocalyptic cult. And that's something that has stuck with some Christians at least. Christians always say that the end times are right around the corner. And I guess that eventually they are going to be right. Some kind of a devastating cataclysm is inevitable, and one day they are going to be right. In chapter 26, we have a very famous event during the arrest of Jesus, when one of his disciples cuts off the ear of one of the soldiers arresting Jesus. Later on in the Gospel of John we learn that this disciple was Peter. And Jesus tells him to stand down by saying exactly, "All they that take the sword shall perish with the sword." This is one of those lines which are always brought up when Christianity is meant to be more pacifistic. However, this line is not repeated in the Gospel of Mark, and it is contradicted in the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verse 36, Jesus says, "He that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one." So this line here is very much not pacifistic. I suppose it could be argued that the line from the Gospel of Matthew, "He who takes up the sword dies by the sword," is meant to simply dissuade Peter from violence in that specific situation, because Jesus was meant to be arrested and he was meant to be crucified. And I suppose it doesn't specifically say that taking up the sword is a bad thing. It simply says that he who does it also dies by the sword. Another interesting detail in the Gospels is that after Jesus is already sentenced to his crucifixion, Simon, who is a random passerby, is compelled, so forced, to carry his cross for him. Which, this is in all the Gospels. This is also the way it's depicted in the movie, Mel Gibson's movie, Passion of the Christ, which I did rewatch parts of it before making this video. I didn't rewatch all of it because it is a very, very hard movie to watch. It is just so excessive. But yes, Simon is compelled to bear the cross for Jesus, which I'm not too sure, but I think that the way I remember it, it seemed to be more voluntary in the way that it was taught to me during religious classes in school and maybe in some religious cartoons that I've used to watch here and there. And in the Gospel of Matthew it is not even mentioned at all that Jesus ever carried his cross on his own. It was always just Simon doing it for him. However, in the Gospel of Luke it is implied that Simon only took up the cross after Jesus, and in the Gospel of John it is straight up said that Jesus did first carry the cross by himself, and then Simon was compelled to help him out. I have already many times mentioned that there are many inconsistencies between the different Gospels. Here, for example, I have noted down that before the crucifixion, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is offered vinegar with gall to drink, while in the Gospel of Mark it is wine with myrrh. In the Gospel of Matthew he is dressed in scarlet robes, while in the other Gospels he is dressed in purple robes. And there are many other inconsistencies which are more significant and more important than this. And atheists will often point at these inconsistencies and say, haha, these stupid Christians, they don't know that the Bible contradicts itself, and therefore it is false. And yes, some random Joe Schmo Christian that doesn't read the Bible may not know about these, but Christians have known that the Gospels contradict each other since the beginning of Christianity. Early church fathers themselves compiled these texts into the Bible, and they very easily could have edited them to fit each other better. But they didn't, because they actually cared about preserving these texts as they were. Some of the keenest minds that Western civilization has ever produced have studied the Bible, and many of them remained Christians through their entire lives. So being a Christian is not a matter of intelligence or education. It's a matter of spirit. It's a matter of your own personal sensibilities. One of the things which I found surprising is that the two thieves which were crucified along Jesus insulted him along with the crowd which was gathered around them, which is kind of funny. However, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, one of the thieves actually does side with Jesus, and to him Jesus promises that he will go with him into paradise, which I already mentioned before. Yet another thing which I found surprising is that the first time that Mary Magdalene is mentioned in the Bible is already after the crucifixion of Jesus, right at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. And I've heard about this character before, so I was surprised to see that she is mentioned so late. And a thing that I found funny is that in the fragment when Mary Magdalene is mentioned for the first time, it is said Mary Magdalene and the other Mary being the mother of Jesus. Which is funny because to me that seems like a more important character, but she is mentioned as the other Mary. Also, something that is in the Gospel of Matthew but not in the other Gospels is that the guards which watched over Jesus' grave, were bribed by the chief priests to say that his body was stolen by his disciples at night while they were sleeping, even though they did see the angel that came down from heaven with their own eyes, but they were bribed not to talk about that. The Gospel of Matthew finishes with the line in chapter 28, which supports the idea that Christianity truly was meant for the Gentiles and not just for the Jews. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. And in the Gospel of Mark, it is said, Go ye into all the world, and preach the gospel to every creature. So it does really seem that Christianity was meant for the entire world, and it's not just an idea that appeared later on. And that finishes the Gospel of Matthew. Finally, now we can move on to the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is particularly interesting to me because, according to modern scholars, it is the first Gospel ever written, and I do personally believe that. I do believe that it is the first one, because in many ways it is the most straightforward and the most grounded. It doesn't have a nativity story, we don't get the Immaculate Conception, we don't have the childhood of Jesus, and also the oldest manuscripts that we have end at the moment when the body of Jesus is missing from the grave. However, later manuscripts and the version that we have in the Bible do talk a little about Jesus coming back and the disciples seeing Jesus resurrected. So the very first of the famous lines, which appears in the Gospel of Mark, appears in chapter 5, verse 5, and that is, My name is Legion, for we are many. And this appears in the context of the man who Jesus heals from demonic possession in the country of the Gadarenes, or whatever they were called, the Gentiles. A fragment which I found to be humorous is when, for seemingly no reason, Jesus heals a few people. He heals two people by spitting on them. He heals a mute by spitting on his tongue, and that happens in chapter 7, verse 33. And he heals a blind man by spitting into his eyes, and that happens in chapter 8, verse 23. And that stands out because Jesus heals thousands of other people without having to spit on them. The Polish version of the Bible that I have has notes on the bottom of the page which explain some things and tell you what you are supposed to think about the text. And what they have to tell about this is that here Jesus was emulating the practices of doctors, because in those times it was believed that human spit has some healing properties. So Jesus was emulating doctors because he didn't want to give away his power. Jesus does actually say in many places to the people that he healed that they shouldn't talk about it. They shouldn't give away that he has those powers. Another line that was notable to me personally appears in chapter 13, verse 35 of the Gospel of Mark. Watch ye therefore, for ye know not when the master of the house cometh. And this line is notable to me because it appears in the movie Shawshank Redemption, when the protagonist is talking to the prison warden, and the warden answers him with a line from the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 12. I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. So yes, I've known these lines from that movie for a very long time now. And movies are such a powerful thing in our modern times. Stories themselves are very powerful and very dangerous, because they shape the way that you view reality. But movies are especially dangerous because you can see the events happening before your very eyes. So they are extra potent at shaping your perception of reality. And that's why they should be approached with great caution. Moving on with the Gospel of Mark. During Jesus' arrest in chapter 14, there is this one very confusing part, which I found to be notable because of how confusing it is. And I quote here, "And there followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about his naked body, and the young man laid hold on him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked." So this appears very much out of nowhere, just as it appeared out of nowhere in this video. While Jesus is being arrested, this one random young man shows up and he loses his loincloth and he runs away naked. And it is not very clear what this is supposed to be. The Polish version seems to imply that this young man was one of the followers of Jesus, and when they tried to arrest him, they grabbed onto his clothes, so he freed himself from his clothes and ran away. And that's what this seems to be about. But it is very confusing the way it is written, and that's why I found it notable and why I'm telling about it to you. In the Gospel of Mark, we finally get a little bit of an explanation what was Barabbas guilty of. As most of us know, Barabbas was the criminal which was next to Jesus. The governor of Judea, Pilate, pulled up these two criminals, Jesus and Barabbas, and he asked the Jews which one of them they would like freed, and they chose Barabbas. But in the Gospel of Matthew it is not said what was Barabbas's crime. In the Gospel of Mark we are finally told that he was an insurrectionist. In the Gospel of Luke it is further specified that he was guilty of sedition, which is the same thing. And the Gospel of John says that he was also a robber. So yes, it does seem that Barabbas was essentially a revolutionary for the side of the Jews against the Roman Empire. And that's all that I have to say about the Gospel of Mark. It is shorter and simpler than the Gospel of Matthew, but at the same time it also gives you a little bit more specifics about names and events. And so we move on to the Gospel of Luke. Yes, the Gospel of Luke. Right off the bat I've noticed that the Gospel of Luke gives more attention to female characters, such as Mary, the mother of Jesus, and also Elizabeth, which is a character that interacts with Mary. Elizabeth is a woman that also has somewhat of an miraculous pregnancy. She did not have an immaculate conception, however, she was unable to become pregnant her entire life, but God allowed her to become pregnant in a very advanced age. And she gives birth to John the Baptist, which is a very important character in the Gospels. I haven't mentioned him until now, but he does get mentioned a lot, and he is a precursor to Jesus. There seems to be a bit of a tension between him and Jesus, or at the very least between his disciples and Jesus' disciples. But the Gospels do insist that he never tried to be Jesus' competitor, and that he was simply somebody who prepared the way for Jesus to come. Right, the Gospel of Luke does not mention anything about the parents of Jesus going into Egypt during Jesus' childhood. There is no Herod and no slaughter of the innocent babies in Bethlehem. But the Gospel of Luke does specify why Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem. The Gospel of Luke specifies that Joseph had to go to Bethlehem in order to be taxed, because Caesar Augustus ordered the entire world that was in his control to be taxed. And I suppose that Bethlehem was simply the place that Joseph in his region had to go to be registered and to pay his taxes, I suppose. In chapter 4, verse 16, we find out that Jesus could indeed read, because here he reads from the book of the prophet Isaiah. And since he could read, that obviously means that he could also write. Which begs the question, why don't we have any writings of Jesus himself? I'm not aware if there are any non-canon writings which are attributed to Jesus himself. but if there are, there's probably a good reason why they aren't canon. So Jesus did not seem to care about writing anything down. And that goes for all early Christians in general, which seems to support the theory that early Christians believed that end times are right around the corner, and therefore what's the point in recording anything? In chapter 10 of the Gospel of Luke, we have this very interesting fragment where Jesus gathers 70 additional disciples, additional to his 12 apostles, and he also gives them the power to heal and to do other miracles, presumably. Which was very surprising to me because, like I already said, in my head Jesus was always the only one who could do miracles. But here he gives the power to do so to 70 additional people. Later on in chapter 10 we have the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is one of the more famous parables, and I've been waiting for it to show up, and here it is. In chapter 11, verse 8, we have this moral lesson that, strangely enough, tells you that you should pray often, because when you pray often it bothers God, and God is more inclined to give you what you want. And this sentiment is repeated in chapter 18, verse 1 of Luke. Which seems strange to me, especially since this is contradicted in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 7, which says, Matthew 6, 7. 6, 7. But when ye pray, use not vain repetitions, as the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking. So here the Gospel of Matthew tells you that while praying you shouldn't be repetitive, but the Gospel of Luke tells you that you should pray often in order to bother God, and God will be more inclined to give you what you want. I guess if you wanted to, you could somehow try to make these two lessons fit. Like maybe you should pray often and about the same things, but you shouldn't be too repetitive in any given individual prayer. But it doesn't really make sense. In chapter 12 of the Gospel of Luke we have another one of those moral lessons that are meant to discourage you from hoarding wealth. Because what's the point in hoarding wealth if you're going to die one day? You shouldn't be gathering riches in this world, you should be gathering riches in the other world, by doing good deeds. This time the lesson is in the form of a parable. And this is another one of those moral lessons which I personally disagree with. Because here it asks you, why should you hoard wealth if you're going to die one day? And my answer to that is, in order to pass it down to your children, in order to build a dynasty, and to ensure that your descendants are as successful as possible, and as happy as possible. Later on in chapter 12, I've already mentioned earlier about verse 49, I am come to send fire on the earth, but later it also goes on to say, suppose ye that I am come to give peace to earth? I tell you nay, but rather division. For from henceforth there shall be 5 in one house divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. The father shall be divided against the son against the father, and so on and so forth. So here we have more of that talk how Jesus is coming in to bring division to families. This is continued in chapter 14, verse 26. If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Which again you could interpret in many ways. In chapter 15 of Luke we get the parable of the prodigal son, which is perhaps the most famous parable in all of the New Testament. And what the message behind this parable comes down to is that there is more happiness in one repenting sinner than in 99 non-sinners. So God is more happy about one sinner who comes back to him than in more people that always remain loyal to him. But he still obviously loves those people. In chapter 19, verse 27, we have a very interesting line, which seems to me to imply that you should kill unbelievers. These are Jesus' words. But those mine enemies, which would not that I should reign over them, bring them hither, and slay them before me. This is one of those lines which are not so pacifistic in the Bible. In chapter 22 we finally have at least a little bit of an explanation why Judas betrayed Jesus. I've been wondering this entire time. Why did Judas betray Jesus? You have to keep in mind that Judas is one of the 12 apostles, one of the men to whom Jesus gave the power to do miracles. And yet Judas still thought that it was a good idea to betray this guy. The Gospel of Luke says here that then entered Satan into Judas. So this implies that Judas betrayed Jesus because Satan entered into him, which could mean many things. Later on, the Gospel of John tries to give further reasons why Judas betrayed Jesus. The Gospel of John says that Judas was simply a bad person and a thief. He was stealing money from the other disciples because he was in charge of their money purse. He carried everybody's money and he was taking it for himself. But I don't know, for me these explanations do not seem to be satisfactory. Judas received from Jesus supernatural abilities, and yet he still betrayed him for just some pocket change, which is just strange. In chapter 23 of the Gospel of Luke, we get two very famous lines during the crucifixion of Jesus. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And also, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And these are two of the most famous lines during the crucifixion, along with the one that shows up in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. God, why hast thou forsaken me? And that is the end of the Gospel of Luke. That is all I have to say about the Gospel of Luke. Moving on to the Gospel of John, which is the last of the Gospels, thank God. The thing that I've noticed right away with the Gospel of John is that it is more esoteric than the other Gospels. Here for the first time Jesus is described as the Word made flesh, which you hear about a lot. You hear about the Logos a lot in more esoteric Christian circles. Also, for the first time, Jesus is described as the Lamb of God. And it is also for the first time said that Jesus has existed since the beginning of the world, and he only chose to incarnate in flesh now. There is a big insistence on the importance of belief in Jesus, and there's also a big insistence on love. The Gospel of John is more intimate than the other Gospels, since it is supposedly written by one of the 12 disciples. Similarly to the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew is also attributed to one of the 12 disciples, while the Gospels of Mark and Luke are attributed to just some random early Christians. Mark allegedly being a translator of Peter, which was one of the main 12 disciples, and Luke being a companion of Paul. And we'll get to Paul later. So yes, John. A big insistence on the love between Jesus and his 12 disciples, especially with John. In one scene, John even rests his head on Jesus' chest, basically snuggling with him, which is not gay, okay? Before the 21st century, men could snuggle with each other without it being gay, so that's fine. The Gospel of John is the one that differs the most in its chronology from the other Gospels, I think. For example, already in chapter 2, verse 14, Jesus very famously chases the money changers out of the temple in Jerusalem. Also, here in the Gospel of John, this is the only place where it is described that he used whips to do so. In the other Gospels, this event happens during the last days of Jesus, when he goes into Jerusalem for his final time. While here in the Gospel of John, Jesus goes in and out of Jerusalem many times, and this event happens much earlier. Also, the recruitment of Andrew and Simon Peter differs slightly than the way it is described in other Gospels. In chapter 2, verse 4 of the Gospel of John, we finally have Jesus turning water into wine. And I've been waiting for this event this whole time, because it's one of the more famous of Jesus' miracles. And you have to wait until the Gospel of John for him to do it. He does walk on water in the previous Gospels, and that's his other most famous miracle. But here he finally turns water into wine. And what I find a little bit humorous is that Jesus seems to do it somewhat reluctantly, or at least that's one of the ways that you could interpret it. The way it happens is that Mary, the mother of Jesus, comes up to him and she asks him to turn water into wine during this wedding celebration. And he tells her, "Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come." So here it seems that he doesn't actually want to do it, but he does it anyway for his mother. However, in the Polish version it is somewhat different, because in the notes in the Polish version it is said that when Jesus says, "Woman, what have I to do with thee?" that is actually a Semitism, which is a Jewish expression that essentially translates into "no problem." So he doesn't mind doing it. Here in the Gospel of John, in chapter 2, verse 19, we finally have an explanation of something that appeared in the previous Gospels without an explanation. In the previous Gospels, one of the accusations that the Jews threw against Jesus is that he said that he could destroy the temple in Jerusalem and rebuild it in 3 days. But he never said it there, and it was never explained why the Jews accused him of that. However, here in the Gospel of John, the Jews ask Jesus for him to give them a sign of his divinity. And he says to them, and I quote, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." But what he was actually talking about was his body. He meant that if they kill him, he will resurrect himself after 3 days. But they did not understand him correctly. Right, and here in the Gospel of John, there is a few lines here and there that, when taken out of context, could imply that Jesus himself was something external to Jews, because the word Jew is used a few times to describe people who oppose Jesus. For example, in chapter 3, verse 25, then there arose a question between some of John's disciples and the Jews about purifying. So here it talks about John's disciples, which were adjacent to Jesus' disciples. Also in chapter 7, verse 1, it says that Jews wanted to kill Jesus, and later on it says that nobody dared to speak about Jesus openly for fear of the Jews. So when you read these lines out of context, that could imply that Jesus himself was not a Jew, that he opposed the Jews. However, this is clearly not the case because of all the other parts of the Bible where Jesus is described as a Jew, and even in the very same Gospel of John, in chapter 4, verse 9, Jesus is talking to a Gentile woman, and she says to him, "How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria?" So here she directly calls Jesus a Jew to his face in the very same Gospel. And further on in the same conversation between Jesus and this woman, he says to her, "You worship ye know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews." In chapter 8, verse 7 of the Gospel of John, we get one of the more famous lines in the entire Bible, and that is, and I paraphrase, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." And the way that I was always taught is that this happened in the context of Jesus preventing Mary Magdalene from being stoned for the crime of prostitution. However, here in the Bible, in the Gospel of John, this woman is not Mary Magdalene. Her name is not mentioned at all. This is just some random woman, as far as we know, who is accused of adultery, which I suppose could imply prostitution. But yes, the name of Mary Magdalene is not mentioned here. Later on, also in chapter 8, verse 44, we get another very famous line when Jesus is addressing the Jews, and he says to them, "You are of your father the devil." Which, yes, that does seem about right. In chapter 11, verse 35, we get another one of the more famous lines, which goes, "Jesus wept," which very famously appears in the horror movie Hellraiser. And here in the context of the Gospel, this happens during the funeral of a man called Lazarus. And this is another one of those events for which I was waiting for this entire time. Because Jesus goes on to resurrect this man, Lazarus, and the resurrection of Lazarus is one of the more famous of Jesus' miracles. But it only appears here in the Gospel of John, the last of the Gospels. In chapter 14, verse 6, we get another famous line, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh into the Father, but by me." You hear it here and there. Right. Approaching the end of the Gospels, in chapter 19, verse 44, we have the famous event when one of the Roman soldiers pierces Jesus' side with a spear to check if he is already dead. And obviously this is a very famous event. It plays a very big role in the legend of the Holy Grail, and it does not appear in the previous Gospels, only here. In chapter 20 of the Gospel of John, we have an event that I find to be very significant, but I've never heard about it before. This is already after the crucifixion of Jesus, after he was killed and risen from the dead. He appears to all of his apostles except one, because he just happened not to be there. And they see him resurrected from the dead, they rejoice, and they tell the remaining apostle, who did not see him, the apostle Thomas Didymus. They tell him that they saw Jesus resurrected, but Thomas does not believe them. He says that he has to see Jesus with his own eyes. And I find that to be significant because Thomas is one of the 12 apostles. He is one of the people who was granted by Jesus the power to do miracles. And he saw numerous miracles with his own eyes. He did miracles with his hands. And yet he still doubted Jesus' resurrection. And he had to see Jesus come back with his own eyes before he believed it. And the reason why I find that significant is because nowadays Christians are expected to believe in Jesus simply based on this text and based on the cultural legacy of Christianity. Meanwhile, in the Bible itself, Thomas, one of the 12 disciples, does not believe it until he sees it with his own eyes, which he does eventually. That is significant. And also in the context of this event here, Jesus says the words, "Blessed are they who have not seen and yet have believed." Which I think, although I am not entirely sure, that this is one of the lines that is quoted by Joshua Graham from the video game Fallout New Vegas. And so we have finally arrived at the end of the Gospels. And also at the end of this video, because this has already taken much more time than I wanted it to, and I am done for now. If people are interested in this, if people watch this video, then I will also upload my analysis of the rest of the New Testament, and possibly the Old Testament when we get to it. But if people don't care, then I guess I'll just keep it to myself. But for now I am done, so bye bye. I love you. Moving on to the Gospel.